Folks, welcome to what we expect to be a very special night tonight. We've got some interesting folks. We're going to do the STEMI Showdown. We've got some new sponsors, and we've got some prizes to give away. We're going to do that right after this.
This program has been made possible in part by a generous donation from LifeCare Medical Transports, driven to fulfill the unique transportation needs of medical facilities and patients throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia, with a commitment to the highest quality clinical standards, cutting-edge technology, and compassionate patient care. And distributed through a partnership with EMS World. For more than 40 years, EMS World has been the destination for emergency medical providers, public safety personnel, and other healthcare professionals to access instantly usable education and operational information in print, online, and at live events.
Thanks, everybody. Welcome back. What you've just seen is probably a very important part of what we do tonight. Without the sponsorship of the people that sponsored us for this show, there's no way we could have done this. And we'd very much like to show our appreciation to LifeCare Medical Transports and also to EMS World Magazine. And the interesting thing about that is they have committed to air and to send out this monthly on a monthly basis. So it's going to give us an opportunity to have a sort of a national audience for a small show that normally you don't get. So we'd like to thank them very much. We couldn't have done this without them. So let's get on with the STEMI Showdown. I have the first of our guests here tonight I'd like to welcome. And he's probably a guy that has, when I read his resume, you're going to be impressed by his resume. But I think he's got an interesting story that I'm going to ask him about. I don't know that he knows I'm going to ask him about it. But please welcome Dr. David Burt. Dr. David Burt practices emergency medicine at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, and is current director of the Chest Pain Center there and the UVA Guatemala Initiative. He's actively involved in STEMI, ST segment elevation, myocardial infarction, outreach and education at a local, state, and national level, and focuses on the application of system engineering principles to reduce reperfusion times in STEMI. He's the founding member of the Virginia Heart Attack Coalition, and he also serves on the board of the Chest Pain Centers of Virginia. Welcome. All right, so impressive resume. Academic prowess, but that's not the whole story. How did you get into medicine? You and I talked on the phone the other day, and I found out something about you that I had no clue about. Tell me David Burt's story right from the very beginning.
Well, I grew up in North Dakota, not South Dakota. People often ask me about that. And then out of high school, I went into the United States Marine Corps.
Right.
Do you have any Marines in the audience?
Hey, two of them over there in the corner.
All right, outstanding.
And you describe yourself as a particular type of Marine that they'll all understand. What sort of Marine were you?
Hollywood,
Yeah.
as we call it in the Marine Corps. So if you go to boot camp from the west side of the Mississippi, you go to San Diego, and they call you a Hollywood Marine.
Yeah, I have an answer, and I have a particular interest in this. I've got 3 kids in the Marine Corps, and probably about 4 years ago, I learned what a Hollywood Marine was. I had no clue what they were talking about, but there is a bunch of competition between the guys or girls who go to Paris Island and the ones who go to San Diego. So there you go, off topic as always, the way I always am. We're going to talk about STEMI. So for STEMI recognition, what I'd like to do is ask you, there's a lot of discussion about whether acquisition interpretation should be done by ALS providers versus BLS providers. And I know when I went to one of your presentations before, you talked about the coast watchers, and there seemed to be a suggestion that you felt that they could have pattern recognition without really understanding the pathophysiology behind it, and it really could be quite effective. What's the theory behind this coast watchers? What's that got to do with it?
Well, back in World War II, we actually trained a lot of people who had very little formal education on how to recognize Japanese planes and ships. And they didn't need to know what the ship was doing or what the plane was built of, but they became very adept at picking out key pieces of the infrastructure or what the plane looked like on silhouette. And so it's the same thing with STEMI recognition, and that is, if you can look at enough ECGs to know what normal looks like, then you start to know what not normal looks like. And at that point, then, you can start to pick out what a STEMI looks like. So you may not know exactly what's going on underneath, but you then can pick out a STEMI out of that, what we call haystack, because there's not many STEMIs, right?
Yeah, and I think one of the things I'd also ask you is a lot of people talk about when should you actually do the 12 lead? When is it not necessary to? I've heard a lot of people say, you know, you need to have some very defined things before you ever do the 12 lead. What's your theory on that? When should you use the 12 lead? Use it liberally, use it conservatively? What do you think?
So a 12 lead, when you're out in the field, it's a vital sign, right? Think about it this way. You look at a patient, they look fine. Most patients that are really sick, they don't look that good. But a person can be having a massive heart attack, and the only thing that's going to pick it up is a 12-lead EKG. They can have heartburn, they can be dizzy, they can be weak, and anybody at any time underneath, it can be a heart attack, right? And so the only way you're going to pick up more heart attacks is if you do more 12 leads. And that's it.
So you got the 12 lead, and whether you're a BLS or an ALS provider, from your experience or what you've been taught, you think this looks bad. What should you do then with it? We're told, you know, transmit it immediately. Some people would say you transmit it and you talk to whoever the receiving facility would be. What's your feeling on that? Should you do both? And when should you actually transmit it? At what point in that encounter should that 12 lead be sent to somebody?
Well, that's a good question. And let me ask you guys, any of you have STEMI vision? You know what STEMI vision is? It's this idea that the sole job of EMS is to drive around picking up STEMI patients. That's all you guys do, right? And that's what the cardiologist might think. But the reality is you've got belly pain, intoxication, belly pain plus intoxication, whatever it might be. And the moment you do a 12 lead on somebody and you think it's a STEMI, then the whole situation changes because it flips from the usual EMS, bring them back alive as quick as possible, to stop, make a decision, and then bring them in. Because the quicker you make a decision on a STEMI patient, the quicker the reperfusion machinery gets rolling, right? Because as you're coming in with the patient, maybe the cath lab has to come in from home, and none of that happens till a decision's made, right?
Sure.
So if you do a STEMI, if you do an ECG and you think it's a STEMI, you should really stop, make contact, talk to somebody, transmit, whatever the protocol is, and get a decision made. And that's very different than most of the time where you don't need to talk to us, right? But if there's a STEMI and you think it's a STEMI, whatever, calling downstream triggers the machine.
So there's some discussion, and I get asked some questions within the department, and seems to be two sort of avenues that people look at this. One of them is that, you know, you see the patient, he's sick, she's sick, you get him out of the house, you put him in an ambulance, and you head towards wherever the definitive fix is for that person. At the same time, you're doing your 12 lead, and you're transmitting it, or you're calling, you're doing all those things. The converse side of that is wait a little extra time in the house, get the 12 lead, send it in the house, and talk to the doc, then get in the truck and heads towards the definitive fix. If you had your druthers, which one would you tell people you'd like to do?
I would say do the 12 lead. Look at the 12 lead, and if you think it looks bad, if it says ... acute MI across the top, or you think it looks bad, then I bet most of your protocols say something about reaching out and contacting the potential receiving facility in some form. And that's what you just have to do. Because if you do that 12 lead, you think it looks bad, and then you start moving towards your destination, you've actually not done anything to help the patient yet. Because the trigger, that decision point that's going to let you get that patient reperfused more quickly, you've not done anything, right? So it's a paradigm shift. It is that 1% of the time, stop, talk to somebody, and then bring them in.
And I think that is a change, because I think traditionally over the years, EMS have had it browbeaten into them. Don't waste any time whatsoever at the scene. Always get in the truck and do whatever you're going to do in the truck going. So this is something that's a little, I think, different than is taught in most courses. You're saying take that little bit of time. It's worth the investment in time. Get the 12 lead. Get on your phone or whatever, radio, whatever you have. Let everybody know in advance what's going on. And that's a good investment in time.
Oh,
What's
without
your
question.
opinion?
You know, I always say, at the front of every EKG is a patient, right? It's going to be someone's grandma or grandpa or uncle. And the best thing that you can do for a patient, if they have a STEMI, is make a decision. And if you get a 12 lead and it looks bad and you make a decision and it turns out they don't have a STEMI, well, it's their lucky day, right? No one's going to grumble about that. But where we hurt people is if we don't do a 12 lead or we don't make a decision. We're not looking for these really complicated little cases. Most of the time, that STEMI's right there. It just doesn't get done.
And I'd agree with you. That seems to be just the logical performance and order that things would go in. But I got to be 100% honest with you and tell you that there are many times where I've heard from EMS providers where they go through this process, and we all know that, you know, all that looks like STEMI may not necessarily be STEMI. They get to the ER, it turns out not to be truly a STEMI, and they receive holy hell from that receiving facility. How, as a physician, can you educate your colleagues to try and be a little bit more understanding of that error? There are errors that happen. There are errors that happen in the hospital. Is there a new wave of education that has to happen to have people be more understanding of, I don't want to say mistakes, but everything is not exactly always as it seems.
Right. Culture change, right? And so if everything is done appropriately and you do a 12 lead on grandma, and she has ST elevation, and you punch the button and you pull the cath team in from home, and they cath her and her arteries are clean, is that a mistake?
I'd suggest no.
No, it's a lesion. It's an activation without lesion, right? It's not a false activation. It's an activation without an intervention. And that's powerful because when you change the vocabulary, you change the culture.
And when we did the Cracking the Code was the last video we did on this about a month ago, I made a reference to the London Ambulance Service, and they are very proactive, very aggressive in how they do their 12 leads. And there's a particular interview done with one of their interventional cardiologists, and his statement on that was, I'm expecting 10% of the people who come to me to either have a true activation, there was nothing wrong with it, but there really was no lesion, or there to have been an error somewhere along the line. One or the other, 10%, he's entirely happy with that. You think that's reasonable? 10% of the people don't actually have a lesion, or there's something that went awry in the decision process.
Yeah, 10% would actually be outstanding. In fact, most systems around the country that really work at this, 17% activation without lesion rate, that's fine. It's just the cost of doing business, right? Because it's far better to activate without a lesion than hesitate with a lesion, right? And that's where STEMI is such an interesting diagnosis, because there's few things in medicine where 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes makes a difference. But on an early STEMI where the cells are dying every minute, think about what 5 or 10 or 15 more minutes of oxygen can do for your heart, right? And that patient may live, but 5 years down the road, maybe that patient that you reperfused 20 minutes earlier, maybe they're playing basketball with their grandkids instead of watching it from the sidelines with heart failure, right? And our studies don't particularly pick up that, but it's there. So
And I think that's something we're going to address in the second half of this program. I think as EMS providers, we're trained very much to be very involved in the moment, that hour, half hour that we have the patient. And I've had some conversations recently with my chief and with some of the people who work for us. And I think what we failed to do, and I don't want to be very namby-pamby, touchy-feely, and anybody who knows me, that's not really the sort of person I am. But when you have a good outcome, you don't just have a good outcome for that patient. Granted, on that day, you're the advocate for that patient. You're absolutely behind them 100%. But when there is a good outcome, you have an outcome for their kids, for their kids' kids, everybody that they meet. And if you think of that as a tree, there's hundreds of people have a good happening because of the 1 hour you spent with that patient. So I don't think that that's something that we, in our training courses and everything, we don't look at the bigger picture. We don't look at next day, next year, what society gets out of us doing a decent job for 1 hour. Years and years and years of benefit. And we're going to talk to a couple of people here later in the show that have had that personal benefit. So, Dr. Burt, if you were to have a choice. Not everybody has 12-lead ECG ability. Some of them have the ability to take or receive or excuse me, to acquire the actual ECG reading, but they can't send it anywhere. And those things I think people tend to mistake that not everybody, you can get the 12-lead, but not everybody has invested in the technology to be able to send it anywhere. If you had a choice, and I have the 12-lead in front of me, and it was only two options, I'd send it to you, or I'd call you up and talk to you about it. Which would you like as the receiving doc? Would you like to hear from me, or would you like to see it in your hand?
Well, so there's a question as a doc. I'd like to see the 12-lead. As a patient, I want you talking to me, right? Because if you're out in the field, you're running EMS, you've got a patient, and you've got a 12-lead, sure, you might be able to transmit it, but if you can't, really, who cares? As long as you can establish contact with the doc and talk about the patient, talk about the findings on the EKG, that's all you really need. Transmission's nice, but it's kind of like the icing on the cake. Nice to have, but if you don't have a good cake underneath, it's not going to help, right? So first, you got to do the 12-lead. Second, recognize that it's something wrong. And then third, make a decision. And if transmission can help you do that, that's great. But if not, nothing takes the place of education.
Absolutely. So it really, you would, if I was stuck, my machine broke, or just my agency doesn't have the ability to transmit that, you'd rather I talk to you than actually transmit you the piece of paper.
Yeah, without question. Absolutely.
I think that a lot of the folks around will probably agree with me here. That's not necessarily always the case. A lot of people, a lot of areas, and maybe this is part of what you were talking, the paradigm change. A lot of areas do not want to activate the STEMI and open the cath lab unless they have that in their hand. And do you think that's something that's hurting this whole reperfusion, the speed of reperfusion, if we're unwilling to open the cath lab unless we have the piece of paper in our hand?
Yeah, there's a saying that the easy ones are easy, right? And so the solution is just make more of them easy. And this is easy stuff. Patient looks bad or not, you do 12-lead. 12-lead looks bad, you talk to somebody. And every time you do that, you give some feedback. And you keep on educating people out in the front lines, and your system has to improve, right? And the one thing that can kill that is if you get what I call ER doc grouchitis. You guys maybe have seen this a little bit before, where you call in a report and they don't take you seriously. And it is kind of actually satisfying when you're right and you walk in and the doc's like, oh. But that sets a culture of greater and closer communication between the ER doc and the EMS professional, right? And so calling in a 12-lead that looks bad, sure, there might be a little resistance up front at first, but it's just part of culture change, and that's kind of hard sometimes.
When you describe ER grouchitis, I wish we had a camera behind us and they could see Forbes. Everybody's going,
nodding,
we've all had that happen to us at one point or other.
Just like we had cardiology grouchitis in the early days.
Absolutely. You had to fight with them. I think it's a paradigm change. I think, I don't know, 86 or so when I started doing this first. And I won't swear to it, but I think you were given a little heparin. You were put on the floor, and we really hope that you do very well. There wasn't a whole lot of stuff we did for people in those days and age. And that's not that long ago. I mean, the cycle of change in the last decade alone is just alarming. But with that cycle of change, there are so many more people that not only don't die from their STEMI, but they recover really quite well and have really good lives. So I'm thinking, in my mind, years and years ago, you might not actually have died, but you might not have had that much of a quality of existence. And like I say, you're going to meet some people tonight that are absolutely every bit as healthy now or better than they were before they had their STEMI. Several people have said to me before we were coming in here, you can't get them all. You're going to make a mistake. Do you think, if we're looking at the amount of STEMIs that are missed, what's the number one thing in your mind that causes you to miss a STEMI? To completely miss the ball altogether.
So why to miss the ball? Well, so there's two reasons. Most STEMIs aren't missed because someone doesn't notice them. They're missed because an ECG is not done or it's not looked at. When we look at cases gone bad, it almost always comes back to someone had symptoms and they didn't have the classic Fred Sanford. You guys remember Fred Sanford? Coming, Elizabeth, right? So not every ECG looks like that, right? But that's that Fred Sanford syndrome. If you get away from that and you start doing ECGs on the weak and dizzies and the heartburns and the belly pains, pretty soon more STEMIs start to pop up, right? And if you start looking at them and you know what to look for, then you start to recognize more. And then that leads to a quicker decision. And then that's what leads to quicker reperfusion.
And I think just as we end up this section, before we get on and actually do the showdown part of it, I think that's something that we probably need to emphasize. And we're going to meet a gentleman later on in the show that is a classic example of that. He wasn't your textbook, they teach you in class, crushing chest pain, looks grey, you know, sweating like pig, and a blind person could have figured out this man's not well. He had some pain, there's no doubt about that, and he'll describe it to you. But he didn't get anywhere in that textbook STEMI thing, and his day ended up pretty badly. And luckily, the right things were done very quickly. He got reperfused incredibly quickly. So would you think that it's a reasonable thing to tell providers, you know, you've said have a really low suspicion, do lots and lots of 12 leads is what you're saying basically. And that'll also help you not miss this gentleman, for example. If you have any suspicion at all, what's the cost of the paper? Do the 12 lead.
Yeah,
Is that reasonable?
It's nothing. And so I kind of sit at what I call the STEMI Citadel. I'm at a large PCI center, right? And so for me to call a STEMI alert, I just punch the button, and in comes a cardiologist, in comes the team. Everything's easy. But where we're really making these amazing situations and cases is people have throat pain, and somebody out in EMS land gets a 12 lead. And 99 out of 100 times, it's throat pain, right? And then once it's not. And once you get one of those cases, we were joking the other day, it's kind of like a good form of cocaine, right? Because you get a rush from doing the right thing.
Well, you don't want to do bad cocaine.
Yeah, and bad cocaine is even worse than good cocaine. So it's really amazing. These cases just keep popping up. And actually, the other day, I realized that we expect these cases to go well now. When someone goes, I think that was really a lucky case. Luck has nothing to do with it, right? Someone did a 12 lead, somebody looked at it, and someone made a decision. And then the system got activated, and it all worked out.
Well, I think as we come to the end of this segment, we're about to do the actual STEMI showdown itself. I think from what we've got from what you've told us is please don't be shy to do the 12 lead. Even if it's not the classic presentation, do the 12 lead. It's the cost of a piece of paper. If you have a choice and you're not able to send the 12 lead to anyone, at least call up and describe what the patient looks like and what you're seeing on the piece of paper that you can't transmit. Have a very low index of suspicion, and these patients that we talked about that are being missed are much less likely to get missed.
Yeah, I mean,
at
the University of Virginia, our protocol is patient looks bad, do a 12 lead. Think the 12 lead looks bad, call medical command and summon the attending to the phone. That's one of the few calls at UVA that will come to the phone for. Usually the residents work with our EMS professionals. But when an EMS professional thinks they have a STEMI out in the field, whether or not they can transmit, we don't care. We just want to talk to them about the ECG, talk to them about the patient, and then make a decision. And if the decision is to activate the cath lab and the lesion, there's no lesion, fine. The ones that we feel bad about are if the ECG is not done, or we don't talk to EMS, and the decision's not made. And that happens everywhere.
And I think a lot of EMSs really don't be on the fence. Make a decision. In life in general, I mean, analyze what you got and take a position and stick with it.
Yeah, the ECG, it's a vital sign. You know, your patient has VFib, they're laying on the floor. But
I can even figure that one out.
Yeah, I mean, if they're not moving and they're laying on the floor, bad. But we've all seen STEMIs that are just sitting there smiling at us, right? And then 2 minutes later, they're on the floor. So this is a disease that 5 or 10 or 20 minutes can make an incredible difference. And you've all brought in a STEMI patient, right? And then 5 minutes later in the ER, they arrest. What if they would have called EMS 5 minutes earlier? And what if we would have alerted 10 minutes earlier? Maybe they would have got to the cath lab before they arrested, right? You just never know. So in STEMI, earlier reperfusion is almost always better, unless you do something crazy like drive 700 miles an hour to get there. But you guys are all professionals, so
That would never, ever
you don't have to worry about that.
Never, ever do that. So folks, that's sort of the background behind what we're about to do with the STEMI Showdown itself. Like I said, we're going to meet some interesting folks. But before we do that, we're going to take a little break. As I said earlier on, a lot of people have shown some interest in these video programs that we do. And right now, we're going to take that break, take a little bit of time out to recognize some of those people who have actually picked up and helped us distribute the videos over the last month. Join us when we come back.